And let's turn to Genesis chapter 30 as we continue through Genesis tonight. As we finish Genesis chapter 29, we find that Jacob has become the father of 4 sons through one of his 2 wives by the name of Leah. And she gives birth to Reuben and Simeon and Levi and Judah. And ultimately this man is going to end up with 12 sons. His name is going to be changed from Jacob to Israel. And each one of these sons will become the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel. And the remaining sons that are going to be born all the way on through Joseph are recorded in the verses we come to now. Benjamin his birth is recorded in subsequent chapters. So we pick it up in chapter 30, verse 1. Now when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister. Envy is a work of the flesh. And there's a lot of different types of names we can give to envy, that we can give to jealousy. But it's of the flesh. And it, yet today, splits asunder many, many families. And of course, God doesn't give us any place for polygamy today, the marrying of 2 wives or the having of 2 husbands. And he has 2 wives, which is trouble to begin with. Nothing wrong with wives, but that's just trouble, period. And so here she is envious of her sister because her sister is having children and she is not having children. Let me say this about envy, especially if you are dominated by envy in a marriage relationship or in a family relationship. The solution to that envy will not be found in necessarily your partner changing, though if they are less discreet than they ought to be, that can be helpful. The problem is a problem of trust, and that issue must be dealt with between an individual and God. And that's who she's going to be directed back to by her husband in terms of getting it solved. Envy is a terrible, terrible divider in relationships. And so she says, as she sees her sister giving birth to these 4 sons, she has no children, she's barren, and she says to Jacob, "Give me children or else I die." And Jacob's anger was aroused against Rachel. And he said, "Am I in the place of God who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?" And I think that this is very interesting instruction in terms of the marriage relationship also. I think it's a wise word to wives. Something you should know about men. And that is, men have been called by God to nourish and cherish their wives. And when they do that, and they do that as best as they are able at that point in their life, they give themselves fully to trying to supply and provide for and make happy their wife. If their wife is then yet dissatisfied and asks the impossible of him, then at best you will make him mad, and at worst you will distance him very greatly. And Jacob here is very upset because what is being asked of him only God can provide. And occasionally, not so often, but occasionally wives will ask the impossible of their husbands. And the wife who is always just one thing away from being satisfied. And then once that's supplied, she's yet another thing away from being satisfied. Ad infinitum, ad nauseum. It is very frustrating for a husband because, again, there's something that he feels about himself personally in terms of how he's doing with God and his obedience to God and how he's just doing, period, in terms of what the response of his wife to his best efforts. Now, if he's a sluggard, that's an entirely different issue. But here is a man who is having the impossible asked of him, and it frustrates him a great deal. And what he does is he points her back to God. And that's good for women to know. It's good for men to know too. Ladies, There are some things that your husband is never going to be able to provide for you. There are some things in terms of the providing of children, the providing of some levels of encouragement and help and these kinds of things that are going to come from them, but sometimes what you're asking for can come only from God. Can only come from God. And sometimes we like to think that they'll come from this man, and if he was doing his job, he'd provide all of these things. He's not God. You already know that. So why do you struggle with it in terms of the demands? And so he's not God. And this is an impossible thing that's being asked of him, and he points her back to God. Am I in the place of God who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb? And so she said, here is my maid Bilhah. Go into her, and she will bear a child on my knees, that I also may have children by her. Now this is an interesting methodology. And then she gave him Bilhah, her wife, her maid, as wife, and Jacob went into her. And Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. And Rachel said, God has judged my case. Oh, has he really? I think that he graciously, overwhelms it with himself. But I'm not so sure. In fact, I'm quite sure this was not part of his plan. But this comes out a little more fully later. God has judged my case, and he has also heard my voice and given me a son, and therefore she called his name Dan, which means judge or justice. All right, now some justice is finally being done around this household. Oh, it would have been a fun household, I'm telling you. And it gets worse. And Rachel's maid Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. And Rachel said, with great wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister, and indeed I've prevailed. And so she called his name Naphtali, which means my wrestling, as she's wrestling now through this means with her sister. And when Leah saw that she had stopped bearing, she took Zilpah, her maid, and gave her to Jacob as wife. Yes, I'm flabbergasted. And I've read this a million times and I'm flabbergasted. And Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a son. And Leah said, a troop comes. Yeah, we're going to have a bundle here. And so she called his name Gad, which means troop. And Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. And then Leah said, I am happy, for the daughters will call me blessed. And so she called his name Asher, which means happy. Now Reuben, who is the oldest son, probably about 7 years of age at this point in time, went in the days of the wheat harvest, and he found mandrakes in the field. And the mandrakes were an orange-colored berry that were considered in that day to be something that would increase the fertility of women. Well, you can imagine how attractive this would be in this household. And so he finds the mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. And then Rachel said to Leah, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. And Leah said to her, is it a small matter that you've taken away my husband? Would you take away my wife's mandrakes also? A little testy there, I'd say. Ooh. And when Jacob... let me stop there. Verse 15. And she said to her, is it a small matter that you take? Okay, my mandrake. And Rachel said, therefore he will lie with you tonight for your son's mandrakes. And then Jacob came out of the field after a hard day's work in the evening, and Leah went out to meet him and said, you must come in to me, for I have surely hired you. Well, I don't like that terminology, but you have hired you with my son's mandrakes. And so he lay with her that night, and God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. And Leah said, God has given me my hire because I have given my maid to my husband. And so she called his name Issachar, which means hired. And then Leah conceived again and bore Jacob a sixth son. And Leah said, God has endowed me with a good endowment. Now my husband will dwell with me because I have borne him 6 sons. And so she called his name Zebulun, which means dwelling. And afterwards she bore a daughter and called her name Dinah. And Dinah will come in to play in chapter 34 when we get to that. And then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. And she conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my reproach, because to be childless in that day was considered to be a reproach by God. And so she called his name Joseph, which means an adding, and said, the Lord shall add to me another son, hopeful for another son. And it came to pass, when Rachel had borne Joseph, that Jacob said to Laban, send me away now, that I may go to my own place and to my own country. Now remember that Jacob his name means heel catcher. It means supplanter. Loosely paraphrased, it means con man. It means swindler, manipulator. The guy that always gets his way, whatever it takes to get it accomplished. He's an enormously talented individual. And Laban is the guy that God has chosen to bring into Jacob's life, who is just like Jacob, in order that he might remove from Jacob those characteristics. And so here these two manipulators come together. And Laban is going to try to manipulate the manipulator. Laban is going to try and defraud Jacob. And he is going to be fruitless in his attempt to do it. And the reason that he's going to be fruitless is because God is for Jacob rather than Laban. And it is important for us, as we're going to see Laban for a couple more chapters, important for us to understand that whatever situations we find ourselves in as Christians, we are not in them alone. And we will run into Labans. We will run into men who will do everything that they possibly can to shaft us. And yet, they will not ultimately prevail because of God's being for us. They may appear to prevail for a time, but if they appear to prevail for a time, it's only because we haven't seen the rest of the story yet in our lives. And so here we see a beautiful picture of God overruling even a Laban, the Labans that come into our lives. And so Jacob says, I want to go away. I want to go back to my own home, to my own country. Give me my wives and my children, for whom I have served you. I've served you for 14 years for them, and now I want to go. Let me go, for you know my service, which I have done for you. I've fulfilled my commitment. And Laban said to him, please stay, if I have found favor in your eyes, for I have learned by experience that the Lord has blessed me for your sake. God is with you, and I don't want you to leave me, Laban says to Jacob. And then he says to Jacob, name me your wages, and I will give it. Free agency here, right here in chapter 30 of the Bible. Name your wage to get you to stay. And Jacob said to him, you know how I have served you and how your livestock has been with me. For what you had before I came was little, and now it is increased to a great amount. And the Lord has blessed you since my coming. And now, when shall I also provide for my own house? I've worked hard for you, but you have reaped all of the profits. I have a family. I have children. I need now to look out for their future and to establish my own household. And you haven't allowed me to do that. You've taken everything that I've earned. And so he said, Laban said, what shall I give to you? Doesn't want to lose him. And Jacob said, you shall not give me anything. And in this he is like Abraham. When Abraham turned down the reward of the king of Sodom, so he said, I don't want even a latchet from your shoe, because I don't want you, once God does what he's going to do in my life and through my life, to say that you're the one that was responsible for the prosperity in my life. And so here he says, I don't want you to give me anything. And Jacob is typically like that. I mean, he's a self-made man. He doesn't want anything given to him. He says, if you will do this thing for me, I will again keep and feed your flock. Here's my wage. Let me pass through all of your flock today and remove from there all of the speckled and the spotted sheep and all of the brown ones among the lambs and the spotted and the speckled among the goats, and these shall be my wages. And so what he says here now is this huge flock that Laban has, and the dominant traits of these animals in that day were that the sheep would be completely white, and the goats would be completely black, and the cattle would be completely brown. And so the streaked or the spotted animal was the non-dominant gene, whatever that word would be for that. It wasn't the dominant gene pool. And so he comes along and he says, listen, I want you to go ahead and take your flock, Laban, and take every spotted one, every streaked one, every one that is multiple in color, and remove it from your flock so that you leave just solid colored animals here. And then as those solid colored animals breed with one another, and they breed with the dominant traits of solid colors, whatever would be born to them that is spotted and streaked, that'll be my wage. And then he gives the reason for it in verse 33. So my righteousness will answer for me. And he's trusting in God. He's saying, take it out, we'll see what God does here. We'll stack the entire deck against me. And then we'll see what it is that God is going to do in time to come, when the subject of my wages comes before you. Every one that is not speckled and spotted among the goats and brown among the lambs will be considered stolen if it's with me. And Laban jumps at this deal. Laban says, oh, that it were according to your word. Are you serious? I mean, he just can't believe. You have to be a Laban to understand the excitement of this man's life. I'm getting excited, aren't I? But anyway. And so Laban removed that day the male goats that were speckled and spotted, all of the female goats that were speckled and spotted, every one that had some white in it, and all of the brown ones among the lambs, and he gave them into the hands of his son, and then he put 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flock. He doesn't just separate all of the spotted and the streaked from Jacob just 1 day's journey, but 3 days' journey. He doesn't want any of them coming back and being accounted to Jacob's portion, and he doesn't want them breeding with the solid colors. So 3 days separate, not just 3 days. It's kind of interesting that when you are a person who can't be trusted, you usually don't trust anyone even though they're trustworthy. And that's why he doesn't trust. This man has never done anything wrong to him in 14 years. But he doesn't trust him. Why? He doesn't trust himself. And so Jacob took for himself. And this is Jacob at his Jacobiest. This is Jacob in all of his glory in terms of the flesh. This thing that he does. Now Jacob took for himself. You think, how is he going to do this? Rods of the green poplar and of the almond and chestnut trees, and he peeled white strips in these rods of these limbs, and he exposed the white in each of the rods. And the rods which he had peeled, he set before the flocks in the gutters, in the watering troughs where the flocks came to drink, so that they should conceive when they came to drink. And so he is devising some means, and the word conceive there in verse 38 and then again in 39, it means to go into heat. He is doing this in an attempt to bring the animals into heat so that they will reproduce with greater frequency. It's very scientific, mind you. That's his desire. And so the flocks conceived before the rods, and the flocks brought forth streaked and speckled and spotted. And so as they come into heat, and so here is Jacob manipulating, and he's putting in these limbs, and he's stripping them, and all the while he's thinking, man, I'm smart, and it's sending them into heat, and what's being produced out of these sexual unions are streaked and spotted animals, and he thinks it's all his manipulation and his conniving, and it's not. In just another chapter, he's going to look back on it and say, God had it. didn't have anything to do with that. How often, how we come up with our devices. We come up with our little things, and this is the key to, ministry, and this is the key to the third wave, and this is the key to this, and you just gotta, strip down the branches and get them before the people, get the vision before the people here, and they'll start to multiply, and the Great Commission will go, and all of the devices that we can do in our private life and in our spiritual lives. And all it does is it just slows everything down. Because now God has to come to me and reveal to me that it wasn't my inane manipulation, but it was His grace. It was His grace. And Jacob's going to learn that. But in the meantime, he's sweating up a storm, peeling these branches, and I get all this, taken care of. And then Jacob separated the lambs and made the flocks face toward the streaked and all the brown and the flock of Laban. So he's going to have them this is kind of lamb visualization. He's got them looking at the streaked and the spotted lambs over here, and Laban's group, he's got his separated over here, and then amongst the sheep were supposed to be white, and so where there were brown sheep, he had them looking at the brown sheep, this suggestion, how it affects that gene pool. And so, anything he can possibly do here. But this is Jacob. This is Jacob. But he put his own flocks by themselves and did not put them with Laban's flock, because he wanted to breed streaked with streaked. He's a smart man. And it came to pass, whenever the stronger livestock went into heat or conceived, that Jacob placed the rods before the eyes of the livestock in the gutters, that they might conceive among the rods. And so he only among his flock bred the strong with the strong. He didn't breed the weak. And when the flocks were feeble, he didn't put them in. And so the feebler were Laban's and the stronger Jacob's. In other words, he's going to tell you if you take a 3-day journey from me. And he just lets the random reproduction occur among Laban's flock, but in his flock he's being very selective, and in terms of frequency and in terms of stronger with stronger. And thus the man became exceedingly prosperous and had large flocks, female and male servants, and camels and donkeys. Chapter 31. Well, this is going great for Jacob, but the sons of Laban are not excited about what is happening, because they are watching their father's flock dwindle down and Jacob's flock get bigger and bigger. And it's happening because of what God is doing, not because of what Jacob is doing here. And Jacob heard the words of Laban's son saying, Jacob has taken away all that was our father's, and from what was our father's he has acquired. As we continue through Genesis tonight, as we finish Genesis chapter 29,